In today's fast-paced, chaotic world of modern technology, scientific advances, and instant information, what does it matter that 500 years ago, a lone monk, armed with his 95 church grievances and theological arguments, would ignite what would be called the Reformation? The more we look and the deeper we dig, we find the impact of that day surrounding us more than we may realize. October 31st, 1517, an unknown monk named Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses onto the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany. More than an argument against clerical abuses and corrupt church practices, the 95 Theses became a catalyst for wide-ranging changes in not just the church, but also the political system and society itself. And these changes still affect us today. I'm your host, Sandy Miller, on our journey to uncover the impact of the Reformation today. The wages of sin is death, but while here on earth, the punishments for sins can be alleviated through penance. In the early church, penance was only used in rare circumstances, but by Luther's day, it was a common practice required of all Christians. Penance are acts performed by the sinner to lessen punishment and gain forgiveness. The severity of the penance depends on the seriousness of the sin. From the mild, reading devotions or the Bible, fasting, reciting chants or prayers, to the more extreme, wearing a cilice or even self-flagellation. By the 10th century, penance can include making trips to holy places called pilgrimages, or viewing relics with special holy powers, even buying indulgences, pieces of paper with the power of forgiveness.
Late medieval Catholicism provided all kinds of ways of trying to make sense. I don't want to sound too sort of intellectualist here, but to deal with it, to cope with it, right? You could go on pilgrimage, you could pray for healing, there were relics, there were shrines. This was all about trying to deal with the misfortune that people experienced. And so if you take those away, well, what's in its place?
By the 1500s, Pope Leo encourages the sale of indulgences as a way to raise money for the church, specifically building the extravagant Basilica of St. Peter. A monk named John Tetzel is given the territory of Germany to persuade the people there into buying indulgences to help fund this church in Rome. He convinces the people that when you buy indulgences, you are buying forgiveness. This infuriates Martin Luther.
And he has to clear the function of the word of absolution. And first, he understood the absolution. I absolve you from your sin as a declarative act, a speech act in a declarative sense. And in a second step, in an efficacious sense, as verbum efficax, as a word which does what it says. I deliver you from sin, and the sins are forgiven. Speaking this in the authority in the name of God.
He had shifted the definition of what it means to be a Christian from basically a ritual-based religion, a religion that tries to approach God on the basis of human, not just works in general, but sacred good works, especially in participation or attendance at the Mass.
Luther, he's not just attacking indulgences, he's attacking the way in which people are misunderstanding indulgences and the way in which this preaching undermines the gospel itself.
One of the ways that the church taught people to understand suffering and to try to seek to cope with it was to view the actual suffering that they experienced, even sort of daily toil by which you get your daily bread, as a kind of penance. And if you endured it patiently and faithfully, didn't murmur and grumble like the children of Israel, This could reduce time in purgatory. This could help reform your character and help conform you more to the image of Christ, rendering satisfaction for sin along with Christ's merit for sin. And you can find pastoral manuals, confession manuals, where lay people are specifically instructed to ask their confessors, I've endured this suffering, please count it to me as a penance for my sin. Well, Luther posed that doesn't work with justification by faith, because all penance has been paid for by Christ. Everything has been paid for by Christ. And so, well, what's left then? Luther could still talk about suffering as a means of conforming one to Christ. He could still talk about it as a means of developing compassion for other people as they suffered, so that one could understand their suffering. First and foremost, though, it was a test of faith.
That's what the Reformation is always about. It's about the reform of preaching. It's about getting the gospel out to all the people so that they understand what the mercy of God is, and that it's not something for sale.
Every sermon has the function to set free, to free the sinner, and to say, you are free, don't fear.
Society before the Reformation consists of a complex interweaving of nobility with other societal statuses. It is not a simple lower class, upper class system. But the Reformers give people a new sense of their own worth and identity. And while not altering the structure of the social system at the time, people stand taller with an altered perception of their own dignity. This higher opinion of self-worth is still prevalent in today's society. In the Middle Ages, people considered their work as a means of survival, work or die. To have a calling meant to do churchly work, be a priest or a monk. But the Reformers turned this philosophy upside down.
The very term vocation itself, of course, just comes from the Latin vocare, to call, and to literally is to call something. So the vocation is the sense that God has called you, He's given you this to do. It's a calling from God.
Now the term calling was a word that in medieval Europe had been restricted to the callings of the church. The monks, the nuns, the priests had callings, the other people did not.
For Luther, one does not have to leave society to follow God or to be honoring God, but one has to be involved in society. This is huge, especially when you think about the Middle Ages, when anybody who was going to be really serious about doing the God thing or kind of get right with God, you had to forsake family, you had to forsake connections in this world and go join a monastery. Basically, that was the track. You had to do the God track. And the idea of a person staying in this life and trying to be God-pleasing, that was just kind of like, you can't do this. So when Luther comes to the realization that, no, in fact, obedience to God means doing what God put you here to do, which means being involved in this world, this was huge. It was essentially redefining the entire culture he was living in. It was changing the way everybody saw everything. And instead of having to join the monastery to be serious about being right with God, I could simply be a good father.
Most of the population lived in the household, in the oikonomia. They were the farmers and the artisans and the merchants and everybody else. A small percentage of the population, though perhaps larger than we would guess in some big cities, at least 10-15% of the population, lived in the church. They were monks, nuns, priests. And then a very, very small percent lived in the political office of the rulers. And you had one area of responsibility. Luther came to see that that wasn't the case at all.
For Luther, vocations primarily are rooted not so much in your vocation as in your career or your occupation, something you do to get money. Your vocation's more into the thing that God has called you to do. And so for Luther, it's always grounded in family relationships. Who's my father? Who's my mother? Who are my siblings? And then where am I living? Who are my neighbors? What do I owe these people around me? That's where vocation starts.
We have family responsibilities, economic responsibilities, occupational responsibilities. We have societal responsibilities, and we have responsibilities in the church. And each one of us has a unique set of responsibilities to the family circle, the occupational circle, the societal circle around us. I think that's still very helpful in talking about the structure of life.
Your calling is your purpose in life, not merely the way you make a living.
Luther saw that the spiritual class, the priests, the monks, the bishops, were no better in God's eyes than the non-spiritual class. Well, then the way was open to view all sorts of vocations as ways to serve God and neighbor and to please God and neighbor. Let's say a baker wanted to serve God better. Luther would say, do a better job at what you do then. Make sure the bread is baked in a very fine way. Make sure you don't charge too much for it so people can't afford it. Make sure that your bread, in fact, goes for nourishment and that you deal fairly with all people. He would tell a mother, love your children and raise them up to be good Christians and good citizens.
The purpose of vocation is to love and serve your neighbor.
The real goal is on the vocation, your calling, no matter what. And I really define the difference as being that's work, job, career, profession, and it has your name on it. You can switch professions, but if you have a vocation, you write out unemployment, you write out being overpraised or everything else. And that's at the heart of Luther's whole concept of life and daily life.
You know, people often credit the Puritan work ethic with the, America's greatness, but really the Puritan work ethic is just grounded in Luther's doctrine of vocation. Had Luther not given this, there would be no Puritan work ethic. It's not Calvin's idea, it's really Luther who's saying, go do what God's giving you to do and giving you the freedom to do that.
But I think Luther's societal theory, as stuck in the Middle Ages as it was, is still very dynamic and very useful for talking about the worth of human life and the dignity of every individual in our individual sets of callings. I think that works today.
God does not need our good works, but our neighbor does. Before the Reformation, the role of the family, of one's body, even sex, is marginalized. In fact, 1 in 4 people have taken vows of celibacy, considered to be the greatest religious aspiration. But Martin Luther radically challenges this. He preaches that to be married is the epitome of religious life, going so far as to say that procreation is the greatest work of human beings. His ideas tear into the very fabric of society. Celibacy is out, procreation is in. In the Middle Ages, the celibate life is considered more holy than married life. This belief leads 25% of the people to celibacy.
In the late 15th century and early 16th century, approximately 1 in 4 people had taken a vow of celibacy. 25% of the population are seeing marriage, both socially and religiously, as something to be avoided.
The Middle Ages had placed marriage, it wasn't evil, but it was on a lower scale than celibacy. Celibacy was a holier way of life. And Luther said, no, we've practiced celibacy just to earn our way into heaven, so it was a matter of his basic understanding of our way of salvation. But it was also part of his doctrine of creation, that he has created us in the family and created the family to nurture a human life and bring us up in the fear and admonition of the Lord.
By the time you get to the late Middle Ages, there clearly is an established hierarchy of what it means to be religious. In the late Middle Ages, to be religious is to follow this monastic pattern, to follow these vows of celibacy, obedience, and poverty. In particular, the interpretation of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and his dialogue with the rich man was used to justify these 2 different tiers of Christianity, these 2 types of religious life. When Jesus met the rich man asked, "What must I do to enter eternal life?" And Jesus says, "You know the 10 Commandments, follow those." And his response was that, "I have done all these since my youth." So then Jesus responded, "If you would be perfect, sell all you have, give to the poor, and come follow me." The church took this dialogue between Jesus and the rich man and interpreted it as talking about 2 different types of religious life. On the one hand, you had people who, living their life in the world, tried to be obedient to the Ten Commandments, and through that kind of life would eventually enter into the kingdom of God. And then there were those people who would be perfect, and they had an advanced spiritual status. They followed Jesus' more strict counsels and commandments. Luther ends up turning this whole notion of a two-tiered Christianity upside down. Instead of the monks or the priests being the spiritual class and lay people being a secular class, Luther recognized that baptism in the Scriptures described all people as priests. This is what truly made you religious. This is what truly made you spiritual. And the role of a bishop or a cleric or a monk was really an issue of human invention, an issue of order, and not an issue of spiritual status.
Once Luther had realized that the spiritual class, the priests, the monks, the bishops, were no better in God's eyes than the non-spiritual class, well, then the way was open to view all sorts of vocations as ways to serve God and neighbor and to please God and neighbor. One of those vocations was the vocation of the family, marriage and family.
The calling of family life, in a sense, replaced the monastic and priestly callings for Luther at the very core of God's plan for society. In the Large Catechism, he says, essentially, if nothing works in the family, nothing else in society will work either.
Father and mother in the family were seen as both having callings from God. These were vocations. They were just as holy as any calling to be a priest or a monk or a pope or a bishop.
As baptized children of God, they all can stand before God on account of Christ. They have roles as parents, father and mother in the home, and they become, in effect, kind of the pastor, the priest and the priestess, as it were, in the home for family purposes.
More religious than the monastic life is the married life. Married life is the epitome of religious life.
As the institution of marriage develops in the Middle Ages, it becomes one of the 7 sacraments of the Church. Martin Luther views marriage from a different perspective.
For Luther, marriage is not actually a churchly act. It's rooted in creation, in the broader life of humanity. In a sense, it's there before there's even a church. It's instituted in Genesis 1, and therefore marriage is something that's rooted in creation, not in redemption. Marriages outside of the church, pagan marriages, according to Luther, are still valid because they carry out God's intention in the first article of the Creed, that human beings would be fruitful and multiply. And this was seen as the bedrock of all social structures.
Be fruitful and multiply is more than a command. It is a divine ordinance of work which is not our prerogative to hinder or ignore. It is not a matter of free choice or decision, but a natural and necessary thing.
By putting marriage into the civic and social sphere, then, it's regulated not by churchly canon law, but rather by the state, by social and civic norms. So much would this be the case that Luther would see marriage as something that happens outside the church, in the civic sphere. And then, perhaps you would go into the church and receive a blessing and celebrate that marriage. Thus, Luther interprets marriage as an institution rooted in natural law and in nature. In his commentaries on Genesis, he reflected how in the Garden of Eden, after the praise of God, marriage and procreation would have been the greatest work of human beings.
Martin Luther is centuries ahead of his time in his writings on the role of fathers.
I confess to thee that I am not worthy to rock this little babe or wash its diapers, or to be entrusted with the care of the child and its mother. How is it that I, without any merit, have come to the distinction of being certain that I am serving thy creature and thy more precious will? Oh, how gladly I will do so.
In many ways, the way that a Christian is going to be most closely conformed to the image of Christ is through washing diapers and caring for kids and just sort of dealing with all kinds of things that are uncontrollable in family life. I think one of the biggest differences between the monastic life that he experienced and family life is that in monastic life, one is still in a sense in control of what's happening because there's a daily regimen and you know what's coming. Now, I mean, it's a human community, so there's unexpected things happening. But nonetheless, it's the regimen, the routine is essential to the spirituality. Well, when you've got, young kids crawling around the floor and who knows what hour they're waking you up at night, you're not in control of this. You're not in control of that experience. So I think in that way, Luther's borrowing of this language from the monastery and applying it to the family life. That shows an important transition in the spirituality. He recognizes that there is a new sphere here. I mean, there were other people who were writing about this before Luther as well, but Luther especially emphasizes family as a primary sphere of spiritual development. And I think that's something that's still extremely important for today.
Today, there are 24-hour news channels, the instant voice of social media, and viral videos making stars of your next-door neighbor. In the early 16th century, the public forum is the town square, or as in Martin Luther's case, the church door. His 95 theses might have gone unnoticed, except for the newest technology of his day, the printing press, which puts his opinions into the hands of the masses. They go viral, and Luther's voice is heard across the land.
The Reformation took place as the culture is transitioning from an oral culture to a print culture.
When people can read, you can stop, think about something, go back, reread. So it becomes sort of your personal internalized message.
As the seeds of the Reformation are taking root, Johannes Gutenberg's printing press is changing the world. What once was an oral culture, where you have to hear the spoken word, becomes a literary culture, where the words are written. As more and more people learn to read, printers devise ways to get their words to the readers and the readers' money into their pockets.
They have everything from broadsheets, where they take a whole sheet and have some kind of illustration with also a paragraph. So people who could read the paragraph, but even illiterate people can look at the illustration and kind of get the point. The folio means we take the big sheet, standard piece of paper, and fold it once, rather like a newspaper. You've got a sheet of newsprint folded once. A second time, and it becomes a quarto. Octavos are cheaper. Of course, every time you fold, it gets smaller and thicker.
The Reformation latched onto this new means of communication, and they flooded the market with Reformation ideas. Everything from pamphlets to almost like cartoon books, almost like what we think of as political cartoons, to sermon books, to catechisms, to learned treatises. They outpublished their opponents probably by 20-1 for several decades.
The church publishes mostly big and bulky books written for scholars, while the reformers produce short little snappy pieces aimed at the laity. And part of Martin Luther's genius is his ability to communicate with the masses.
The 95 Theses, the letter to Albrecht, and then the sermon on Indulgences and Grace that Luther publishes. And those three then will kind of be the essential documents of the kind of spark that leads to the Reformation.
Well, Luther would preach the sermon. He had a manuscript. The text that is published is always longer. But then the sermons would be fleshed out because they also understand people are now reading these things. They're not just listening.
When this sermon comes out, within the next 3 years, there are 20 reprints or 25 reprints, and that's what made Luther a household name.
You know, as much as we talk that the ideas of the Reformation are what caught fire, which is true, almost as important is the way those ideas got out. And that is utilizing every available means of printing them or publishing them.
With the invention of the printing press, the written word becomes accessible to all people. Among the first books printed, the Bible. It's now available for all to see. Martin Luther would insist that any of the changes in Western civilization during his lifetime had been achieved through this availability of the Word of God, rather than by what he and his fellow reformers were doing. But making the Bible available to all in their own language is perhaps Luther's most enduring legacy. Before the printing press, books are rare and take extended periods of time to create. They are handwritten, big and bulky. But the printing press allows books to be created easier, faster, and cheaper, making them more readily available to all. Johannes Gutenberg invents his printing press around 1450 in Mainz, Germany, and one of his first printings is the Bible.
As literacy increases, people can read the Bible for themselves.
People are able to distinguish from all the stories they've been told by the church which ones are from the Bible and those that are popular legends about the saints.
People will sort of on their own get all sorts of crazy notions, but if you put 2 or 3 people together and they discuss things, it's a sort of a break. So well, that's not what the words are saying, that's not what the text says.
When Luther proposed a German translation of the Bible, it was part of an overall program that was based on the idea that all Christians could understand the Bible and didn't need expert interpreters between them and the text.
When people can read, you can stop, think about something, go back, reread. So it becomes sort of your personal internalized message and can mean a lot more than if you just have the oral presentation. Yeah, it's a big deal.
Having the Bible in one's own language would lead to a cultural revolution. In the 16th century, the world becomes simultaneously larger and smaller. The New World has just been discovered, with whole new continents and civilizations revealed. But the view of our world is also changed by the discoveries of Copernicus. The Earth is no longer the center of all things. There is much to learn, and education and schools race to keep up. The Reformers play no small role here, establishing schools, providing public education for boys and girls, and developing new methods of learning in the universities. For the Reformers, the goal is that all people will be taught of God, learning not only religion, but also new things about the vast and thrilling universe. The modern idea that civil government should provide public education for all of its citizens was already introduced by the Reformers.
In 410, the Goths sacked Rome, and that was the beginning of the end of the late Roman Empire. So by the end of the 5th century, many of the structures and institutions of the Western Roman Empire fell apart. And we come into this period which many have called the Dark Ages. And there is some truth to that notion, that especially in terms of the institutions and structures, that they had fallen by the wayside. For instance, education, learning to read, was largely preserved within the religious communities and the monasteries, especially the monasteries of England and Ireland. But for the most of society, those basic educational institutions that we saw in the Roman Empire had gone by the wayside. Not until the 9th century, 8th and 9th century, when Charlemagne became the Holy Roman Emperor and created some forms of stability in the West, were these institutions beginning to be resurrected. Charlemagne had a really important hand in trying to bring education into society. Now he was looking for professional, literate people to help govern state. And he turned to the literate people of society, the church, the monks, the bishops, those people who had retained education, and urged them to establish more schools, more monastery schools, schools within cathedrals. By the time you get to Luther, you end up seeing civic lords more engaged in establishing universities and schools. So, for instance, Frederick, the Elector of Saxony, Luther's prince, established the University of Wittenberg right at the beginning of the 16th century. So Luther saw how important education was for communicating his ideas, for communicating the gospel. You could translate the German Bible, but if no one could read it, it wasn't very productive or valuable. He really encouraged public education We have public education today, but in part the fact that the government saw it as part of its duty to provide for the education of the citizens was passionately argued for by Luther and his colleagues at Wittenberg.
Schools are rare things. Luther wrote a treatise on to the councilmen of Germany that they should establish schools, because schools were a way of general education, which he thought was good, just simply for the populace, boys and girls.
Luther believed that we are called to serve our neighbors. He believed that we should be educated and trained into ways that we can serve our neighbors. And so he wanted children to go to school. He encouraged town councils to establish schools. He encouraged parents to send their children to school. He even encouraged them to send their daughters to school, which was revolutionary at the time.
Early on, one of the goals, stated goals of the Reformation, is that all people may be taught of God. And one way in which people would be taught of God is that they would have direct access to the Scriptures. Children of farmers, children of artisans, go to school, learn to read. Even the girls should go to read, if for nothing else, that they would be able to read the Catechism and the Scriptures in their own language.
Among the normal populace, you wouldn't expect peasant farmers necessarily to do this. And they're the hardest ones to get to send their children to school because they need the kids on the farm. You know, I mean, we still have longer summer vacations because we still have this notion that kids have to go back and work on the farm. It's still a kind of a holdover. And Luther, if he could get them to come even for several months, considered that sort of a success. He wrote a second treatise on keeping children in school, in which he told the people, you spend money on cattle and on barns and on fences, why don't you spend them on schools and on your children?
All of this, not for the sake of self-fulfillment, but for the reason that they could all then become better servants to the neighbor. The girls could become better mothers and bring up their children better. The boys could fulfill their vocations, whatever they may be, whether they were bakers or butchers or lawyers or diplomats. Education helped them fulfill their vocation better.
Philip Melanchthon was the most important educator in Germany at the time. He eventually was called the preceptor of Germany. And one of the things that he did, in addition to writing textbooks that people would use in schools, was even design statutes and curriculum for other schools that other territories would imitate or model. Johannes Sturm was an adherent of the Reformation, lived in Strasbourg, and followed many of Luther's writings. And the way that he saw that he could further the Reformation in his own time was to establish a school. So Sturm's Academy in Strasbourg became one of the most significant and influential schools at that time. He dictated almost every hour of the day on how it would be laid out, the kinds of things a teacher would say from class to class. And so rigorous and well thought out was his school that others would come to watch it and to learn from the model that he gave. One important person was a young French reformer who came to Strasbourg and stayed several months to observe the academy and talk to Sturm and learned about how to further religious education and general education. So impressed was he that he used that model and tweaked it when he went back to Geneva. And this person was John Calvin, who established perhaps the most famous religious academy in Europe at the time. Yeah, the way that Sturm and then others conceived of education was all the way from a grammar school education all the way through gymnasium or what we would say sort of high school education. And in a sense that rigorous division of the hours and the subject matter, those things are carried over into the way in which school, we still see that in school today, third hour math, fourth hour physics. Those kinds of things were principles that the Reformation and many of these famous academies set forth in trying to regulate the entire day with the goal of educating the child.
Education was seen as a public good, not a private good. That is, it was seen as something that would build up the whole society. If you have educated people who are fulfilling their vocations and striving to do better in their vocations, striving to serve their neighbor better in their particular vocations, all of society benefits.
Many things are changing during the time of the Reformation. The impact on the arts is evident as well.
Religious art in the late Middle Ages and in the Reformation was particularly a controversial topic, partly because art was central to many forms of religious piety and devotion. Praying to Mary and praying to the saints also included standing before statues and artwork and using that as a center point of devotion.
Art had a very spiritual, otherworldly intent, meaning that saints were represented, images of Christ, the Madonna and Child, but there's a great emphasis on the heavenly glory.
Art during the Reformation made a move from extravagant images of the saints toward more realistic scenes of everyday life.
This kind of glorified, otherworldly emphasis that the Catholic Church had, the art that kind of comes out of that is going to actually be more humanistic. It's more about real people, real places. There's a sense of historicity versus idealism. The backgrounds become blue. The colors actually become more muted instead of otherworldly and pure, representing perfection. Art became more secular in its focus, and it was more about contemporary people.
However, the artists in the Reformed tradition focused on creation. So you see, especially like, for instance, the Dutch masters focus on still lifes or landscapes and really use their gifts and abilities to represent God, not through images of Jesus or of God, but their religious faith is expressed through the beauty of creation that God has made.
One of the most extreme movements is a resistance to idolatry, which leads to a wave of iconoclasm, the destruction of artwork in the Roman churches.
Iconoclasm comes from the second commandment, where there is, God forbids the creation of graven images. Part of the Radical Reformation took that commandment and destroyed all artwork in the church, perceiving it to be a graven image that would be worshipped.
Some took it upon themselves to destroy statues, to wipe clean art from churches.
People were breaking stained glass. They were bashing up statues, they were destroying paintings, and the creation of these works was forbidden. And you have even things like the crucifix being destroyed or gotten rid of because that is seen as idol worship as well.
Reformer Martin Luther holds to the middle ground and favors art that expresses the work of God or explains Scripture.
Luther was not against the making of images. He explained that images are not a bad thing, but they can be misused. And so he was very cautionary with people in explaining to them, we do not worship these things, we appreciate them and their meaning. He thought that the crucifix was absolutely essential.
He permits the visual arts in the church and actually argues that for many, and especially in a society where reading still isn't prevalent, literacy isn't prevalent, to teach the stories of the Scripture, one of the most potent ways to do this is through pictures, stained glass, statues, woodcuts. One of the most prominent people in Wittenberg at the time was Lucas Cranach, one of Luther's colleagues and friends, and prominent court artist. His most important work, in addition to Luther's portraits, was this painting on law and gospel. He painted it in 1529. Essentially, it's an image where you have a tree dividing the landscape in the middle, and on one side, the tree is dead and darkened, and the images that accompany that side are images of the law. For instance, condemnation of sin, picture of Moses getting the 10 Commandments, death chasing the sinner away. On the other side, though, is a flourishing green tree, and there you have the opposite of the law, the righteousness of Christ's death on the cross, his resurrection, John the Baptist pointing to the Lamb of God, Mary receiving the words from the angel that she will conceive and bear a son, and his name will be Jesus. And so in one image, he's able to encapsulate the heart and core of Luther's theology of justification. Art usually isn't just depicting pretty pictures or portraits of people, but also is telling a story or has a message. And you can see this in medieval art, and you can see this in Reformation art. One of the most popular ways of describing, for instance, the way salvation is given is pictures of the Lord's Supper or of the Eucharist or of the sacrifice of the Mass. There's a famous picture by Albrecht Dürer before he read Luther that has, it's of the Trinity, where it has God the Father holding up the crucified Christ and then the dove. But blood is coming from Christ's wounds, and the angels are around catching the blood in the chalice that would go into the Eucharist. So the story is that the benefits of Christ's saving work are given to the believer through the priest who offers the sacrifice of the Mass in the Eucharist. When you look at Reformation art, the image is quite different. You'll see in repeated areas where there's the crucifixion of Christ, but the blood isn't being caught in priestly chalices. It's being either splashed upon the scriptures themselves or splashed directly upon the believer or the person standing there. You'll see this in the painting of Cranach's Law and Gospel, but you'll also see it in other portraits where there's a picture of Jesus and the blood that comes from his wound is landing on the head or on the hands of those that are in devotion. And that's trying to teach that by faith alone, you receive the redemption of Christ. The believer, even without the priesthood, directly stands in the presence of God, receives salvation and grace by hearing his words and trusting in the redemption that Christ has prepared in the cross.
With the invention of the printing press, religious images move outside the church walls and are now found in people's homes. Printing images of the reformers, especially Martin Luther, adds to his popularity and makes him one of our first celebrities.
Today we're familiar with this cult of personality or the use of the social media to follow celebrities around, Instagram, etc., selfies. Luther maybe isn't the first, but probably the most prominent celebrity at the time that was reproduced visually. So a lot of famous scholars started to have certain woodcuts or portraits made, but Luther's, because of the volatility of his ideas, because of the excitement over him, images were made by Cranach, of course, the court painter, but were associated with his works. And so in a sense, Luther was sort of your first major Instagram celebrity in the 16th century. And so people used his images to make arguments about how important he was, whether the devil was playing his brain like the bagpipes. There's a famous one by his opponent Cochleus that's called the Seven-Headed Lutheran. And so there's a picture of Luther with 7 heads. He looks like a monster. On the other hand, you have woodcuts of Luther in his own lifetime with a halo and the Holy Spirit as if he's inspiring Luther. So the images were potent and they were making arguments for the truth of the text that they were attached to. When the printing press came around, now there was the opportunity to reproduce images as well as text much more readily. And Luther was involved with the production of his own books and the use of images to reinforce his teaching. So Luther worked with Cranach to promote his ideas, to bring woodcuts and visual images in coordination with the words that he spoke and wrote to make his writings more prominent, more popular. For example, Cranach and Luther collaborated on a special brand or frontispiece for the books and pamphlets that he wrote. So Cranach in part invented this border that would go around the title that had images from the scriptures or images that represented Luther's theology, had Luther's name prominently put in the front with his seal, so that if you went to a book fair, for instance, you could see visually, oh, those are Luther's works.
After the Reformation, we also have the rise of the Counter-Reformation, where the Catholic Church was trying to bring back really beautiful, otherworldly art that focused on the suffering and the passion of Christ.
The art of the late Middle Ages will often depict the sufferings of Jesus on the cross, at the scourging pillar, in the agony on the garden, as a massive experience of pain and loss of blood. And that was to stir a religious affection, of empathy and compassion for the Lord in his suffering.
With regard to style and content, today's art world is limitless, but the notable move away from strictly religious images can be traced to the time of the Reformation. Church worship changes drastically as a result of Martin Luther.
And leading up to the Reformation, the congregation wasn't really participating in the divine service. The liturgical leaders were the ones that were leading the entire service. And so the people would gather in the congregational space and just stand there and watch. The congregation was not participating in the service at all.
When somebody came to Mass, it was more than likely spoken. Spoken in such a way that the person who was in the pew didn't really hear what was said.
Luther somewhere says faith is an acoustical affair, which is a nice translation of it. Faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word, and so on.
He tried to bring the music back into the congregational life. So music was part of worship life in the late Middle Ages, but was often conducted by the choirs, and often in Latin. So Luther replaced all of the main parts of the Mass with hymns that the congregation could sing, hymns in German.
To give the voice to the people was really a radical thing.
But in many ways, Luther created what many called the singing church.
Attending worship services changes from merely watching to actually participating.
Well, you were a spectator under the low Mass that he inherited. And you did your personal devotions. When he got done doing the German Mass, you weren't a spectator, you were actually a participant. It was about engaging the people and using the gift of music.
Music is teaching quite a bit of what's happening in people's devotional life. And music is a folk tool, sung at home. Music sustains the day. Music is sung socially. Music, just like in our day, music has a profound impact on the people in that day.
Now, the advantage of a hymn was that it could help their memory for what the church really taught, and therefore the gospel was put into the songs so that the average person, by repeating this week after week sometimes, would be strongly inserted into their memory in a memorable way because it was attached to a tune.
Luther designed those hymns initially to be sung both in the congregation but especially at home.
Participation in other parts of the service is introduced as well.
They would participate in the Lord's Supper rather than just seeing it being performed in front of them.
Communion is a huge issue in the Reformation, both in what it means theologically and adjoined to that people's participation or lack thereof of it.
Just the notion that people who gather to worship should be singing is rooted in some of the basic principles of Luther's reforms.
Except for certain musical styles, how we worship today differs little from what developed during the Reformation. The upheaval of the political system during the Reformation is clearly evident, and the effects are still prevalent. Luther's message is for a faith more personal and the individual conscience, not coerced by either church or state. With the flow of money switching from the church into the hands of the government, the relationship between the church and the state is revised. And we cannot forget the religious wars and violence in the name of religion, evident in the 16th century, and yes, today too. Before the Reformation, violence is not always considered evil, but sometimes a means to a righteous end.
Today, I think most Christians in the Western world are in agreement that violence is inherently evil, and Christians should not resort to violence. That's always sort of a last resort. It's not what we would choose to do, although there may be times where we need to use violent means. But we would certainly not want to use violence in the cause of religion and for specifically religious purposes. That's a view that comes about after the Reformation. Prior to that, the understanding is a bit different in that people understood, and this goes back to late antiquity, understood violence as in itself neutral morally. What made violence good or bad was the end that it served. And so violence in terms of resisting correcting evil was seen as a good thing, and this extended to religious goals, religious ends, and holy wars. That changes with the Reformation. There are a number of incidents within the Reformation, culminating in the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, that caused Europeans to reject violence in the name of religion. The suffering of these wars, especially the 30 Years' War, was so great that there's just general agreement that we should not do this anymore.
But Christian history is not a good record at all on nonviolence, and the Reformation didn't improve it. Got a 30 Years' War out of it, and we still try to make sense of that. Everybody's just killing everybody in the name of God. Protestants will link with other Protestants to kill Catholics. Catholics will link with other. It's just all over the place.
Luther always thought that the church should do without warfare and power and violence. He was clear about this from the beginning. In fact, early on in the Reformation, some knights in the empire offered to lead a rebellion in his name and for his cause, and he politely declined that. He was never interested in that sort of a reformation. And that also colors his reaction to the Peasants' War, where you have this series of peasant uprisings that ultimately becomes a full-scale war or rebellion or whatever you want to call it, with the peasants at least in part claiming justification in Luther's understanding of Christian freedom. And they claim to be rebelling in Luther's cause.
Does Luther's teaching contribute to the Peasants' Revolt? Well, yeah, it does. Luther's devastated by that reality and doesn't like it, but it does. I mean, it's one of these kind of unfortunate side effects. People take the freedom they have and they run with it. This is what Luther discovers in the Saxon visitation. You know, have people misused the freedom they've been given? Oh yeah, bummer.
He had always said very clearly that Christians ought to support the government. And if there's a conflict between what the government is doing and what you think should be done, you simply have to suffer the consequences then.
By the end of the 17th century, the use of violence has become something to be avoided.
There are certain incidents within the Reformation that bring violence into question. A good example is within the Anabaptist or Mennonite tradition. If people know anything about Mennonites today, they'll know that they are absolutely pacifist. They will not serve in the military. That came about as a result of a more violent movement within Anabaptism in the 16th century, where you had radical apocalyptic preachers proclaiming that the city of Münster was going to be the site of Christ's coming in the New Jerusalem. And Anabaptists flocked to Münster. Eventually the city was put under siege and taken and conquered, and numerous people were slaughtered. But the result of that led to the formation of this completely peaceful strain of Anabaptism, and that's what we know today as Mennonites. I think one of the challenges today is we're put in the position in our country, we're given a great deal of freedom to speak and decide for ourselves on things. And we have the challenge of deciding whether we believe a war is just or not.
War and violence is a struggle at the time of the Reformation. It remains a struggle today. The era of the Reformation is a tumultuous time, with religious reform often used as a catalyst for revolution. Luther's freedom of the individual conscience becomes an excuse to defy all manner of authority and fight for causes political, economic, and social. Tyranny and tolerance, virtue and violence could all be justified by religious convictions. But the 16th century is also marked by attempts to argue for political resistance on its own terms. Conflicts are not unique to any age, but the battles fought then have shaped our modern world, even in a country that once fought for its own freedom and independence. Following the Middle Ages, people seek the means for revolt against the tyranny of the times.
Luther believed that princes, dukes, city councils, those in positions of authority, were there to serve the people. They were not there for their own benefit, for their own aggrandizement. They were there to enhance the lives of the people they ruled. And so you find Luther and his fellow reformers admonishing ruling authorities to do a good job, to take care of infrastructure, to take care of the poor, not to cheat people, not to waste people's tax money. Ruling authorities were to be in service to the people.
The reformers speak out against the spiritual tyranny of the church, but some, like Martin Luther, struggle with the writings of the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans, chapter 13.
Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience.
In the early 1520s, Frederick the Wise actually asked the Wittenberg professors whether he could use his armed forces as a prince of the empire against the emperor, should the emperor crack down on Lutherans. Nicholas von Amsdorf, the nobleman, said, well, of course, he's an elected emperor, and he was elected by the electors like Frederick the Wise. He's subject to their discipline. Johannes Bugenhagen and Philip Melanchthon were more moderate. Melanchthon liked the argument that if there's notorious injury, there's a kind of natural law right to defend yourself and whatnot. And Luther said, no, you simply have to suffer for the faith. This led to a kind of crisis for him because governments were persecuting the evangelical faith, and even the House of Habsburg, the imperial house, burned two of his fellow Augustinians and launched the whole story of martyrdom in the Reformation period.
In his writing on the freedom of a Christian, Luther writes parallel statements. The first statement,
a Christian is a perfectly free lord of all, subject to none.
This statement gains great popularity, while the second statement,
a Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all.
This receives less attention from the masses.
The Peasants Revolt, the enthusiasts of the 1520s very quickly disillusioned him, that in fact, left to themselves, people will not only take the truths of the gospel, but will uphold them without a whole lot of help from the magistrate and from the clergy. So Luther was disillusioned at that point.
In 1530-31, when after the Augsburg Confession was given to the emperor and rejected by the emperor, Charles V, and then there was the threat that April 15th, 1531, you guys are back under Roman obedience, or we're going to come with our troops.
When the Smalcaldic War finally came, Charles V was not entirely successful in snuffing out Lutheranism, even in controlling territory. When he's there with troops, people will fall in line. When he leaves, well, the evangelical preachers, the Lutheran preachers may come back. But what is clear is that he may be able to control the territory, but he can't control the hearts and the minds. And people have learned their catechisms, their little booklets at home.
Luther started to rethink his position. So in his warning to his dear Germans, he actually is edging toward what became more explicit in the late 1530s, a theory based on his understanding of Christian vocation. If the emperor is not fulfilling his vocation properly, then he has forfeited the right to complete obedience. And not anybody on the street can resist, but the princes of the empire can resist. In part, that was due not to his theological convictions, but to a constitutional argument. It's a matter of calling, and the princes have the calling to keep the emperor in line. And that idea then influenced some of his followers who resisted Charles V after the Smalcald War in the city of Magdeburg. And in 1550, pastors there drew up a confession, which was a confession of faith, but then also argued for the right to resist the suppression of the gospel, also with armed force, as Magdeburg was actually doing. It was a city under siege.
Within the confession is a direct response to the Romans 13 passage.
Yes, political authorities were appointed by God to do good. But if they are not doing good, then they could not have been appointed by God. Yes, we must render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. But if Caesar wants or takes what is God's, then we must withhold or retrieve it for God's sake. Yes, he who resists the authorities resists God. But if the authorities resist God, then surely we must avenge God's honor.
The Magdeburg Confession became a well-known document. It was written in German and in Latin, and particularly in the city of Geneva, as the French government continued to persecute the followers of Calvin in France. Theodor Beza, for instance, Calvin's right-hand man, picked up the ideas of the Magdeburg Confession, and then from Beza, it goes clearly into the 17th century work on resistance that led the Puritans to justify their revolt against Charles, the Stuart government, and resulted then in the Commonwealth. But even before that, people like John Ponnet or Ponnet, I'm never sure how he actually pronounced it in the 16th century, an English clergyman, an English theologian and bishop. He's a good example of how already in the 16th century, when Mary Tudor, the so-called Bloody Mary, began to persecute Protestants in the 1550s, Ponnet and others picked up on the Magdeburg Bekenntnis, or Confession, and used it to formulate their own theories of resistance.
This gave people the basis for what they consider righteous resistance against the government.
The English had a revolutionary tradition that was really based on common law and the lack of right of tyranny, we might say. No tyrant could be tolerated in human society. People among the early Puritan movement in England already were picking up on the Magdeburg Confession, which reflects Luther's understanding that there's an argument to be made from the calling of the emperor to serve the common good, and when the government doesn't serve the common good, resistance is possible.
As the American colonists consider resistance against England, Poynant's teachings influenced the likes of John Adams, forming a basis for the American Revolution in 1776.
John Adams was a very devout Christian, and he wanted to root his theories of resistance for the American Revolution in Christian sources. And Ponet's argument was rooted in the theories of resistance all the way back to the Reformation. So John Adams recommended Pontet. In fact, in his treatise on the Thoughts of Government, he repeated the basic tenets of resistance that we find in Pontet. What John Adams didn't realize was actually how deeply rooted this argument was in the Lutheran tradition and even in the ideas of Luther himself.
Today, our idea of a just war is traced along this path back to the days of the Reformation. The Reformers are strongly against enforcing religion by the sword or coercing people into a particular faith. This sows the seed for a pluralistic society where many different faiths can coexist in the same land. The legacy of the Reformation opens up the path to the religious freedom of today, being able to believe or not believe anything we choose. The impact of the Reformation today jumps straight off the pages of our history books. James Madison, the father of the Constitution and the author of the Bill of Rights, credits reformer Martin Luther and his doctrine of the two kingdoms for his ideas on church and state. In an 1821 letter to F.L. Schaeffer, Madison writes,
"It illustrates the excellence of a system to which the genius and courage of Luther led the way between what is due Caesar and what is due God. That without a legal incorporation of religious and civil polity, neither could be supported."
James Madison, other founders of the country, valued the Reformation from, first of all, from the standpoint of the priesthood of all believers. In other words, the people are empowered to make decisions for themselves, not only with respect to their spiritual life, but also to their, as far as their life in this world is concerned. So you have really the seedbed for the birth of democracy in the Reformation.
I suspect what Madison was talking about, and at least the way we've come to understand it in our country, is that church and state refers to two institutions. The institution of government and then the institution of the church. Actually, we're talking about two institutions within the same realm. So in other words, when Luther talks about the two realms, he's talking about the two ways in which God rules. He rules in the left-hand realm. I would argue you could call it the realm of creation. And in the left-hand realm, God is ruling for the purpose of preserving life, enhancing life, supporting life within creation. The right-hand realm is where God works his work of redemption in Christ, gathering a new church for the sake of the new creation. Now, within those two realms, I think it's probably somewhat of a stroke of genius on Madison's part to speak of the distinction of two institutions within the left-hand realm.
The U.S. American principle of the separation of church and state, Luther would have found very unrealistic because he believed that every society needs some kind of ideological base. And he didn't think it was absolutely necessary for a functioning society to be Christian. He said Turkish society can also function well. And he thought ancient Rome, ancient Greece had a functioning society without the Christian basis that his society had. But he always saw leaders as working from some religious convictions about what is good for society, what it means to be human, what puts the world in its framework.
Now, with respect to the government itself, I think James Madison finds or plays a very important role because he's really the author, the principal author of the Constitution. And what's unique about him is that, unlike Thomas Jefferson, who went to William and Mary in Virginia for college, James Madison goes to the College of New Jersey, which today is Princeton, which is a Presbyterian school, and he's exposed to Calvinism, which is part of the Reformation. And two things really stand out in terms of his thinking about the government. And number one is that in a Calvinist fashion, he recognizes the sovereignty of God. That God is the one ultimately to whom we owe allegiance. And so that feeds into his thinking about there needs to be religious freedom in America so that people are free to exercise the duty that they have, that transcends the duty that they may have to any form of society, any form of government, allegiance to any institution, and to exercise the allegiance that they have ultimately to God. And then secondly, in Calvinist fashion, he recognizes the factor of human depravity, human sinfulness. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's really based upon Madison's understanding of Reformation theology.
Perhaps no other aspect of Luther's social and ethical teaching produces as much discussion or controversy as his phrase, two kingdoms. And whether James Madison rightly interpreted it or not, the fact remains that roots of the term separation of church and state can be traced back to the days of the Reformation. Martin Luther's Two Kingdoms doctrine teaches that God is the ruler of the whole universe, but that he does this in two ways. He rules temporal, earthly life in one way, which Luther often calls the left-hand realm, and our spiritual life of faith in another way, or the right-hand realm.
The two realms do belong together. They're the same work of God, but you might think of them as creation and redemption. And yet they're not two separate works. We would argue, and I think Luther would, that God's work in the left-hand realm of preserving life in this world is for the sake of Christ renewing everything in this world when he returns. So when I think about the left-hand realm and the maintenance of life, I think of a variety of ways by which God does that. He has provided things like institutions, whether it's family, government, the economy, to assist in the preservation, the promotion, and the flourishing of life. And so where the government then comes into play has to do with establishing laws for the preservation of life.
The founders of the United States recognized, in Lutheran terms, that there was a kingdom of the left hand. In other words, there is a God who is at work in the universe by virtue of his being our creator. He's not a distant God who is backed away from us, but governs the universe.
Luther believed that, in accord with Romans 13 and other passages in Scripture, that God had ordained temporal government. It was needed to keep order in a sinful world, and I think probably initially he thought it was only because of sin, but I think later there are some passages where he suggests that somebody's got to keep order even in Eden.
People in Europe had experienced persecution not only under the state and wanted freedom from the state, but they had also experienced persecution by the church. And so they wanted freedom from the church and its clerics and its laws as well.
What's unique in the American situation is that there is not a state church. So when it comes to defining who we are as a people, what our core values are, and what our purpose as a nation is, this cannot be defined by any church, because there is no established church in the United States. We have religious freedom and so forth, in contrast to the old world in Europe, where there was a state church, and the church's function in part was to help the state define who it is, what its values are, what its purpose is. So the founders here had to define this for themselves, apart from the church.
One great constitutional scholar, Walter Burns, once said that the founding fathers solved the religious question in America by not solving the religious question in America. Had they tried to solve it in a stipulative way that solved everything, it wouldn't have worked.
And so you have Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence saying, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created, a creator God, are created equal, and that we have these inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So there is the recognition of values that are transcendent, that there is a creator God. There's also the recognition that the best way to give allegiance to these values and to this God is to be in service to our fellow human beings. So this constitutes a kind of civil religion. It's revealed to us all in nature. It's there in natural law, rather than in the divine revelation fits very well with what Luther talked about as the kingdom of the left hand. And the church has its role to look after the spiritual well-being of people and where they put their faith as far as their salvation is concerned, and the faith that governs their daily lives, which would fit in with Luther's kingdom of the right hand.
I think George Will, a neoconservative writer, would just say, if you want to talk about liberties, you better know you're talking about Luther. And I think there's a good claim to be had here in that he made people tremble, rulers. He gave people who were more extreme than he, the Mennonites and the Anabaptists, the beginning for their charter, as it were. So I think you can't tell the story of modern liberty without him, but I think we have to know that there are limits to what he meant by liberty and what liberty has become.
So the founders said that unless there were churches that were calling people's attention to these values beyond themselves, also over in the kingdom of the left-hand, democracy would not work, because allegiance to these values would cause people to realize that we're in this to serve the common good. We're not just to serve ourselves, but we're in this to serve the common good of the country.
The 16th century is a time of great social and economic upheaval. Centers of money are shifting, and a rising form of capitalism begins to challenge the church's thoughts on money. Before, money could be used to secure salvation through buying indulgences or giving alms to the poor. But now the Reformation gives money a new focus and purpose. Salvation is not purchased, but is from beginning to end God's gift. Money is for our daily calling in the world and for service to society and neighbor. The faithful Christian life now means working hard, being successful, and earning money, all to the glory of God. Today, the work hard and be successful ethic may often be distorted, but its roots lay in the Reformation.
Time is money. He that can earn 10 shillings a day by his labor and goes abroad or sits idle a half of that day, though he spends but 6 pence during his diversion or idleness, he has really thrown away 5 shillings besides. Remember that money can beget money, and its offspring can beget more.
If time is money, if a normal working day would be such amount, but you only spend half of it working and the rest in idleness, you have to count the money that you would have made. The money is lost. There's a sense that money generates additional money.
He that kills a breeding sow destroys all of her offspring to the 1,000th generation. He that murders a crown destroys all that it might have produced, even scores of pounds.
Well, that's just not a Reformation concept. This is a very American concept, a very foundational principle in thinking about money.
A seminal work on capitalism comes in 1934, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism by Max Weber.
Protestantism has given birth to a kind of work ethic that is the engine behind the spirit in a capitalist economy. So his argument is quite specifically that there are shifts in the Reformation on the way of thinking about vocation, about money, that enabled the possibility of capitalism to go in the direction that it did.
The old feudal society is quite different.
The feudal society has a very different arrangement in terms of labor and work and property. There's this oath of fealty, this oath of loyalty that is taken between a feudal lord who owns the land, protects the land, or perhaps has a claim actually on the family members, the newborn children on his land. And he's supposed to be there to protect them, to protect his land, to guard them and to be their assurance that the world will remain in order. In exchange for the work and the ability to work the land safely, they receive some of the bounty of that land. They also give a significant portion of the bounty of the land and often of their time to the feudal lord.
That's a very different view than if you work hard, then the produce is yours. These are my taters. I planted them. I dug them. They're mine. And who's going to tell me that I owe them to him?
Other things have come into play to move European society out of feudalism to a place that people can say, this property is mine, this work is mine. Luther was living in this transitional period. This shifting stretches from 12th or 13th century into the 16th and 17th century, a long period of transition where goods evermore ceased to be a means of exchange and money replaced goods.
A key characteristic of Weber's argument is this notion that the Protestant Reformation, specifically Luther and then the heirs of Luther thereafter, had a new view of secular vocation, that it was a Christian calling to be a cobbler, to be a farmer, as well as to be a mother or a father. This Christian calling of the secular life, of a life of work and labor, Weber points out is the key shift in Reformation thinking. He notes that when you really see momentum behind capitalism coming, it happens not so much within Lutheranism, but especially as it plays out in Calvinism in countries dominated by Calvinism. The theology of vocation or Christian calling gets tied first for religious reasons and then just for reasons, practical reasons. That with hard work and with one who works well and makes money, has property, that's how you glorify God, living not only as a good cobbler, but the very best cobbler. And you can be frugal, and you can use that money wisely, etc.
The Reformers say being the best you can be leads to living your Christian vocation to its fullest. But for good or bad, this inadvertently opens up the road to our capitalistic society. Usury is the practice of lending money for unreasonable repayment. In the Middle Ages, the church frowned on usury.
Basically, usury is renting out your cash. You loan your money, and you expect to get not only your cash back, but some kind of fee.
In a gift economy context, like for example in ancient Israel, what is held as collateral until the loan comes back is usually something quite essential. And so in this context, the poor can really be exploited. They can lose their cloak or something that keeps them warm until they return the money. So when you think about it this way and look at it from that context, the stories in the Gospels of debt and the forgiveness of debt make more sense.
During the 16th century, the practice of usury begins to evolve.
Johannes Eck is known mostly for his opposition against Luther, his writings against Luther's 95 Theses and other treatises. But before this, his former career was as a theologian hired by Jakob Fugger. Jakob Fugger was one of the richest and most influential bankers in Europe at that time. And through disputations and writing various treatises, Johannes Eck would make some distinctions and carve out a space for a nice Catholic banker like Fugger to sort out his living and justify his business. In order to do this, Eck made a distinction between usury on the one hand, which was clearly forbidden by Scripture, and interest on the other. Interest was a concept, in Latin it just means that which is in between, the time between. And so Eck wanted to argue that it was permissible to charge some kind of money that would account for the time in between the loan that was given and its return.
This prompts the theologians of the day to comment.
In thinking his way through the usury problem, Luther did have some problems of his own. He knew from Scripture that taking interest was not the will of God. On the other hand, he ran a monastery. He ran the Augustinian cloister in Wittenberg. And he was responsible, especially in the early 1520s, for the economic existence of the Augustinian order there. And so he was really challenged because his cloister depended upon the rents, usury-like payments at least, from the people who were farming the land and using what the monastery officially possessed.
Eck wasn't the only one to write on this. Luther also weighed in eventually. He wrote a treatise on usury in 1519, and in 1524 he revised that first one and he lengthened it, included a section on trade.
He opposed it because it fosters greed. It ultimately ends up taking advantage of people who have less money, the exploitation of the poor. Luther was always campaigning for social justice.
And so he agrees with most of the history of thought on this question, a history which reaches back even to pre-Christian period, all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, which sees usury as against the law of nature.
Aristotle regarded money as sterile and therefore it couldn't produce anything more.
And Luther's primary aim in his treatises is against avarice and greed. He says, look, you're in commerce, and if you're embedded in the life of a merchant or in the trades, these are going to happen. You can't escape it. But your best bet is to just try to be honest.
Luther finally says usury is wrong, but finally normal transactions, the kind of commerce we see, what's going on here, could work at 4 or 5% if that would be reasonable, rational, but anything more than that is frankly extortion.
John Calvin has ideas about usury too.
Passages in both the prophets and the Psalms display the Holy Spirit's anger against usurers. Usury almost always travels with two inseparable companions, tyrannical cruelty and the art of deception. This is why the Holy Spirit elsewhere advises all holy men who praise and fear God to abstain from usury, so much so that it is rare to find a good man who also practices usury.
Calvin transitions from here.
The situation in which God brought the Jews together, combined with other circumstances, made commerce without usury apt among them. Our situation is quite different. For that reason, I am unwilling to condemn it, so long as it is practiced with equity and charity, 4 or 5%.
So this now becomes a blank check for Protestantism, in which very few people challenge this interpretation in the end. Where does that leave us today? Well, capitalism has deeper roots than Protestantism.
My ancestors, well, they came in part to dodge the Prussian draft, but they came fundamentally because life was hard in Norway, and life was harder yet in the forests of Thuringia in central Germany. And they wanted cheap land. They'd heard about the dream of cheap land. They came here largely for material reasons. And so it's probably little wonder that materialism, which gives birth to individualism, has come to be the plague on our society that it is.
There was a religious spirit, but that religious spirit is not connected at all anymore. Today it has its own momentum, and the monster's out, and it's sort of hard to rein it back in.
The practice of usury is not tied to any spiritual roots today, but the fact remains, it grew out of the Reformation. Martin Luther's Reformation is first and foremost a reform of pastoral care. People are longing for a deeper devotional life and a greater pastoral presence in their lives, comforting them through illness, grief, and daily life. Even one-to-one praise and prayer. These changes impact people's individual faith and what it means to live a Christian life. Monks are men of prayer and deep religious convictions. They live in monasteries, withdrawn from the world and its pleasures, devoting their lives to prayer, fasting, and meditation. This is the epitome of being religious in the Middle Ages, more about how a person lives, what they say and do, and not so much about a person's beliefs. But living like a monk is hard to accomplish outside of the monastery.
In the Middle Ages, there were sort of different levels of spiritual perfection. kind of the kind of spiritual athletes, were the ones who were in the monasteries. And Luther, I think, wants to do away with that. This is part of the priesthood of all believers.
Luther has made all monks to laymen because he make all laymen to monks. So not only the monks have to pray, but everyone, from the morning prayer and thanksgivings at the table until the evening prayer. Everyone, every Baptist is a monk.
His works, preeminently his catechisms, became guidelines for the instruction of the people and orienting preachers in preaching the word.
That's what the Reformation is always about. It's about the reform of preaching. It's about getting the gospel out to all the people so that they understand what the mercy of God is.
Some of those short little pamphlets that Luther wrote on how best to prepare for death, how to conduct oneself when the plague comes into a territory, how to teach children the creed. These are gems of Christian interpretation of our life with the Lord, but are part of a much larger improvement of the level of Christian life from Europe in the 16th century on down to today.
For Martin Luther, it is not the vows of the monk, but God's promises in baptism that make one religious. For this reason, Luther will say that a person can be more religious by washing a child's diapers or fixing wagon wheels than by being monk-like. It is being religious in whatever context God has placed you. Vocation or calling, terms previously restricted to describe the lives of priests, monks, and nuns, Luther now says applies to all people. And individual Christians have not only one calling, but several, in the home, in society, in church, and at work. Luther hopes to see a saturation of the Word of Christ into everyone's daily lives.
There's a movement that takes place in 1518 with Luther's focus on the way in which the gospel itself, the promise, in the sacraments, in the word, in the spoken word, the preaching, is actually the means by which God makes believers.
Everyone is expected to live not a monastic life per se, but everybody's expected to be a spiritual athlete.
The Reformation is a catalyst for the division of the church and causes people to rethink what it means to be a member of a church. Is it to be a part of a visible institution? Or is it more about like-minded people gathering together for worship? The church splits and becomes fragmented. There are now a whole host of churches to choose from as your house of worship.
When we look around the world in which we're living in the West, it's pluralistic, which means there are multiple worldviews at work simultaneously. You can have someone who's motivated by a Christian worldview, someone motivated by a Buddhist worldview, someone motivated by a I believe in nothing except science worldview. And you just look in the backs of people's cars and see what kind of logos they're sticking on their trunk, and you get a sense of the pluralistic world in which we live.
In the Reformation, the time of Martin Luther in the 16th century, there was really nothing like an ideology of pluralism. No one was advocating multiple religions or multiple confessions. They were all trying to struggle and to preserve the unity of the church and the unity of society.
When Luther started his questioning of the theology of the Roman Church, he was understood by some as simply being part of the way the medieval church worked, which was you had different theological movements held together within the same church. Others understood him as a heretic.
If you were in Germany, you were Roman Catholic. And then as the Reformation happened and that monopoly of the Roman Church upon the religious life was splintered, the various reformers popped up. Luther, Calvin, Zwingli. And they had their different understandings of the Protestant movement, the protesting movement.
You suddenly have the successful survival in Europe of multiple challenges to the authority of Rome. The idea that people could successfully reject papal authority and survive both politically and religiously marked the 16th century movements off as something quite different.
If religious unity was required for military unity, then religious differences were a threat to the political and military stability of the society.
The emperor's in this strange situation of wanting to prosecute Lutheran heresy and at the same time needing the military support of the Lutheran princes.
One of the big rifts among the reformers was between Luther and his colleagues on the one side and the Swiss Reformation, especially Ulrich Zwingli on the other. They didn't agree on certain key doctrines, especially on the Lord's Supper. Now, their disagreement was actually a threat to the solidarity of Reformation territories. There's a complicated background to that with the conflict between the emperor and the princes. And the princes who were harboring the Reformation at the time were trying to show a united front to the Catholic emperor. And unless they could get some kind of deal worked out between Zwingli and Luther, they wouldn't be able to show this united front. Well, Zwingli and Luther were theologians, not politicians. They simply couldn't agree. Well, this theological difference meant that there couldn't be one unified Protestant church over against the Catholics and over against the emperor. One of the issues at Augsburg in 1530 was whether or not the Lutheran way of being Christian would be an acceptable and legal position in the empire, in the territory of the Holy Roman Empire. That was not successful at Augsburg because the emperor rejected the Augsburg Confession.
When this finally goes into open warfare after Luther's death, the ultimate result of that is a victory for the evangelicals that forces the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. And this is where it was determined that the empire could tolerate two separate confessions of faith as long as they worked themselves out along political lines. In other words, territories and princes had to decide if they were going to be Lutheran or Catholic.
You could say that there was recognized and legal pluralism of a sort.
The American Constitution spells out the fact that the government is not going to establish a religion. So you don't have the same pluralism along political lines.
Pluralism in 16th century Europe after the Peace of Augsburg was not the kind of pluralism we have, where the Catholics and the Lutherans and the Methodists are all on the same street corners or a block from each other in the same town. Each territory would be defined as a Roman Catholic territory or a Lutheran territory, and that identification was a result of the personal allegiance of the ruler of the territory.
The Reformation introduced the possibility of choice. Are you going to follow the Reformers? Are you going to stay with the Roman Catholic Church of that time? And so I think one of the things that Luther did is he began to introduce the new age, the modern age, although he did not realize what he was doing.
By the end of the 16th century, there were multiple confessions in Europe, and those existed side by side and not always peacefully.
One of the great things I believe about life in the United States under the Constitution of the United States is that this multiplicity of religious denominations is encouraged. In the Federalist Papers, the founding fathers, James Madison especially, talked about there would be no state establishment of religion, that each, he called them sects, we would say denomination, was on its own. No state funding, no state endorsement of a given religion. And that, I think, has proved to be very, very healthy, because We're in the marketplace of ideas. We're in the marketplace of faith.
Today's pluralism is, in a sense, untethered and wild. And I think some of it is a misreading, not just of Luther, but of the tradition. When pluralism simply means everybody can do just whatever you want, and you invent your own version, I think you're missing a great deal of the heart of the great philosophers of pluralism. Augustine lived in the middle of it, and he does the canopy of the two cities, Luther's two kingdoms, and so on. So you have to bring some sense of order to it.
When I was confirmed, the pastor, this was a long time ago, was talking about the difference of denominations, and he said, imagine that you have half a dozen glasses filled with water, but each one has some admixture of poison to it. Which water are you going to drink? You're going to take the glass with the least and ideally no poison in it. So yeah, we need to be discerning in our denominational age. It's an incentive to be in Bible study.
Luther and the other reformers in the 16th century didn't value variety and religious differences for their own sake. They didn't see pluralism as some kind of inherent good in itself. The society we live in today is a society in which we have daily common experience of wide-ranging religious differences, and that society is a result of the events of the Reformation.
We hope you have enjoyed this journey to the days of the Reformation and have a better picture of the radical changes that began and appreciate the reverberations that started there that impact our world today. For Concordia Seminary St. Louis, I'm Sandy Miller. Thank you for joining us on this journey.